Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Dead on the Money podcast, where two money managers try to make finances a little less spooky. Today we're talking about everyone's favorite topic of debt, something that has kind of proliferated in Canada, specifically here at home, but also is very well known of a topic internationally. Here in Canada, household debt to income is around $1.74, so
Yikes,
quite high among the G7 nations, with a big part of that being rising home prices. A good chunk of that is mortgage debt. So it's obviously a topic that many of us are familiar with, for better or for worse. And today we'll talk about covering some of the basics of debt, but also in terms of tackling bad debt, the difference between bad and good debt. A lot of sort of fundamental discussions of the topic, which, as someone who focuses on investing, might seem like a bit primary to cover, but I think is very important nonetheless, especially
super important
for people kind of diving into personal finance for the first time. So to start off, we figured we'd talk about some stats of debt, because as mentioned, it's unfortunately become more and more of a thing that most households have to deal with to manage with cost of living, which has been rising over time.
Yeah, I think the day-to-day cost of living, rising house prices, everything, it's got to be financed somehow, and I think what's known as the cost of everything seems to be going up a lot faster than what we're all making in income. So that's, it's interesting. But yeah, so just researching it and seeing kind of, putting kind of the numbers to it. I think in the US, one of the stats I found in the US, this was, so the total household debt has increased by 167 billion to reach 18.2 trillion in the first quarter, according to the latest quarterly report on household debt. So yeah, $18 trillion.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not far off the government debt of 34
trillion.
trillion.
That's crazy to think about, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's about what we're making in ad revenue, I think, on this channel too.
Close.
Something like that.
That's right. With what, 10,000 subscribers? Yeah.
But yeah, so 18-ish trillion dollars. This is in the U.S. Almost 13 trillion of that is mortgage debt.
Right. So more than half.
More than half. But that also means there's six-ish trillion of non-mortgage debt. So. So the average American owes about $105,000 across mortgages, auto loans, student loans, credit cards, etc. The other thing, I think that's kind of, it's not just the debt, and I think it's kind of how debt's being managed, but they're seeing that delinquencies, so kind of delinquencies of any duration, they're saying jumped to 4.4% from 3.6. So I think that's something that you'd be
when
watching.
people miss their payment.
Yeah. So saying of any duration, so whether you might miss it just one payment or you're missing multiple, for months, but that's, 4.4% might not seem like a lot, but if you think of 4% of however many trillions of dollars, that's a lot of money that's not being paid. So I think that's an indication that, debt is on the rise, and managing that debt is kind of becoming a concern. But, even though the percentage wise that might seem low, but that's the highest since the beginning of 2020.
Right.
And that was, obviously when we're talking 2020, we're thinking, I guess, COVID and everything too, right? So, and then if we're looking here at home in Canada, total consumer debt in Canada was at the end of Q1 of this year was about 2.5 trillion.
Right. Makes it. We are about roughly a tenth the size of the in terms of population anyway. Yeah. So, but so then we're actually higher than our kind of proportion relative to the U.S.
So yeah, that's up about 4% year over year. More than 1.4 million consumers, so like 1 in 22. Missed at least one credit payment during the quarter. So I think, if we're looking at kind of delinquencies or, issues paying that debt, then I think, you're seeing that here a bit too. So consumer level delinquency rates among non-mortgage holders. So this is, again, like, car loans, kind of credit cards, any kind of consumer loans. The delinquency rates rose 8.9% year over year compared to the 6.5% of mortgage holders. So you're seeing more delinquencies in those types of credit than you are mortgages, which I would assume kind of makes sense. But And then younger Canadians were hit the hardest, with the 18 to 25 age group experiencing about 15% increase in delinquency rates. So we're seeing younger Canadians being hit kind of the hardest.
Yeah, and a big chunk of that is probably not just higher cost of living. Well, it's kind of twofold, right? Because you think of just the past 5 years, we had a spike in inflation. Right. So all of a sudden, the cost of living is up nearly 10% in which year it was. It was 2022 or 2023. And at the same time, you had interest rates increase. It was kind of a double whammy where you're getting hit both on the price side and the spending side in terms of the cost of spending. Mortgages all of a sudden they're still quite expensive relative to the past decade. So you see consumers hit on both sides. So it's kind of no wonder, I guess, that you see debt levels and delinquencies rising at both at the same time.
Yeah, not an easy time. Totally understandable. And then Ontario, the province where we are, we're also the hotspot for financial stress in Canada. That's what I read in the report. So that's something nice. To be, I don't know if there's a plaque coming or whatever for
Put on our license plate.
Yeah, that's the new tagline.
Yeah, that's right.
Ontario is experiencing the most profound increase in delinquency rates across all credit products. So the 90-day mortgage delinquency rate rose to 0.24%. Again, percentage-wise, it doesn't seem huge, but I guess when you're talking about, to me, especially with mortgages, like when you're talking about, being able to pay your mortgage, like kind of any delinquency or any issues is kind of a big deal. But so it's substantial. But that's a 71% increase. So even though it's and then again led the rise in non-mortgage delinquencies up 24%. And then Canada's household, I think you'd mentioned this in the opening, but Canada's household debt to disposable income ratio is one of the highest among GCs, so 170%. So we owe, on average, a Canadian will owe, I guess, like $1.70 for every dollar that we make. So that's it's an interesting stat.
And I know I've looked it up, and I've looked it up before, and I know mortgages play a big role, and that kind of rationalizes it for some people, where you think, well, if I buy, just very simply, I'm not saying this is the average price, but $1 million home, and I have an income of say $100,000, it kind of makes sense. That's a 10 times ratio. Well, if you borrow say 80, it kind of goes to 8 times ratio, but nonetheless, it's still something we've seen increase over time. So home ownership has long been an aspect that people have borrowed for, and we're still seeing that increase. And in Canada, we've seen incentives put in place geared towards helping people, but also not really kind of getting to the root cause, which is incentivizing lower down payments on properties, or making it easier to put lower down payments. So in Canada, you have to pay for insurance in certain aspects with your mortgage, but you can actually get a lower interest rate on a 5% down payment versus a 20% down payment from the actual lender, because there are these insurance programs in place by the government that kind of help cover the higher risk loans from the lender's perspective. And at the same time, we've seen amortization periods pushed out. And, at face value, these are presented as ways to make housing more affordable. And, that there's an argument there that, well, if I have say a $2,500 payment over 20 years versus a $1,500 or $2,000 payment over 30 years, that the latter might be more affordable on a monthly basis. But obviously that means people are in debt for longer, and are ultimately paying more in interest over the lifetime. So it's a really sticky issue. Obviously in Canada, we have a housing crisis to an extent. And you have to deal with like having a roof over your head. So that all comes into play with the discussion. But it also brings up the interesting point of debt being very different, there being good and bad debt. And I don't think that a lot of people would view mortgage debt as being, say, bad debt per se, assuming it's managed properly. Obviously, anyone can over leverage in any sort of category. If you have 200 properties and you're barely making the payments, you're probably over levered. But there is a difference there, and maybe you can talk a bit to kind of the broad stroke overview of what differentiates good and bad debt, or how people use those terms anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I actually went right on and I found right on the Government of Canada's website. And some people might discount anything that's put on the Government of Canada website.
Yeah.
That's not for us to judge. But, I think for one, we're talking about this, I was kind of thinking that the first thing that, everyone's situation is different. Like, obviously, anytime we talk about any of these topics, it's a lot of, generalization and stuff. And some folks are just put in positions, that are kind of out of their control and need to take debt, or kind of getting that in these in unfair or kind of disadvantaged situations or whatever, and they might need to borrow just to make ends meet. And I think I think we found a stat. You found a stat that the leading cause of bankruptcy in the U.S. is medical emergencies, or expenses coming from medical emergencies, which is, it's kind of almost hard to fathom here. It's not even something that we think of, right? Because we know if there's some medical issue, it may take 12 years to get into it
right.
to get
an
MRI or something.
Canada has its own issues, and those issues have been fatal in some situations.
Yeah.
But I would say, generally speaking, certainly from a financial perspective,
that's correct.
Canadians are much better off from the healthcare perspective. The issues often with specialized non-urgent issues that can transform into urgent issues.
Correct, yeah.
In Canada, because we don't have as a robust of a, we've seen cuts in certain areas in Ontario, for example, and so that makes it harder to service those needs. But I'll just say, it is kind of really sad to think about, and something in Canada seems outlandish because we don't have that same kind of vulnerability.
Kind of take it for granted a bit that
if I break my leg, it's not going to,
like I don't have to worry about spending
medical fees,
a $10,000 pill at the. I mean, there are other issues or costs beyond just the cost of the medical procedure, like if you're unable to work or those kinds of things, and that's not necessarily protected here. So I'm not saying a medical emergency couldn't lead to financial hardship here. Absolutely, it could. It's just it's kind of a to a less of a factor, I guess. But and interestingly enough, the biggest leading cause of bankruptcy in Canada too that we found is that it's actually overextension of credit and poor financial management.
Yeah,
so
which might be more what you expect.
It might be more what you expect. That's right. But okay, so when we get to kind of good versus bad debt, I always thought of it, and this is even, I remember kind of learning these lessons from my dad and even my grandpa who would. I remember, helping my grandpa wash his truck, and we'd talk financial stuff, which I don't know if that's normal for most granddad-grandkid relationships, but I mean, and he talked a lot about that kind of stuff, and what he was, was for him kind of, or what I've always learned was kind of the difference between, if it's used for appreciating or depreciating assets, So I think when you look at home purchases, those types of things, but right from the Government of Canada website, how they define good debt is, a good debt helps you achieve important goals. It increases your net worth, it generates income, it improves your financial future. So I guess, investing in a business or buying a home or, and so examples they have student loans. So if you're investing in your education, help you increase your earning potential, right? So you're investing in your human capital, I guess. Mortgages, those types of things. Yeah. Studies have shown that, there's a correlation between education and income. So
very broad, and that's something that I think, it's not to say it's limitless. I'm sure we all know at least one chronic bachelor or master's pursuer that, is probably racking up more debt than they might be able to deal with, or that makes it not worth it. But even with the rising cost of education, which is pretty substantial, it's just a very clear correlation. Like, you look at any study that's done it reasonably, that's taken a broad sample and looked across the board. Obviously, individuals can vary. Some people might pursue a career and not be able to get a job in that space, depending on which program you take. But broadly speaking, when you look at the empirical evidence, it's a very clear correlation with education and income levels. Yes, Jeff Bezos, started Amazon without a master's degree, and people have dropped out of high school and done stuff. But for the vast majority of people, it's outside those outliers. It's a more reliable method of increasing income. So examples of good debt, and also certainly here in Canada, I'm less familiar in the U.S., but I imagine it's similar. where student debt is also low interest, very forgiving, very attractive terms. In Canada, you don't have to start paying interest until you finish your program or graduate. So very attractive features to that debt. So part of it as well is the cost of the debt. That's obviously worth noting. You know, if you have student debt, but it's 20% interest,
Correct.
maybe all of a sudden that's eroding any gain you're getting.
If you put your tuition on your credit card.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Bad debt.
It's still bad debt, even if it's for student, even if it's for pursuing a program. And that kind of brings into the discussion of leverage, which I think is an interesting one, and it goes to show how finicky it can be. But when it comes to buying real estate or even investing, some people use this argument to extend to investments. There is this argument that so long as the interest you're paying is lower than the returns you expect to earn, you can make excess money by taking on debt to pursue that thing. So, for example, with student debts, to speak crudely, you know, you're taking on debt, but you're assuming that the growth in your income will exceed
your
the
earnings
interest
potential over time, over your lifetime working. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. But you can even mathematically apply that to investments and say, well, if I borrow at 5%, but I can earn an 8% return, you can make basically a 3% free return off that money. One way to look at it is if you say put $500 towards a $1,000 investment, and that $1,000 investment grows to $2,000, what's effectively happened is you've doubled your return from, say, 100% to around, you know, I can't think off the top of my head, but it would be kind of crudely kind of the 200% or more than what you would typically have because you've borrowed money to make the investment. The issue with leverage that's worth covering, because I've seen a lot of creators in the space who kind of oversimplify and they say, yep, I'm going to die with debt because I'm making so much bloody money off of buying real estate or whatever it is.
Is it like Rich Dad, Poor Dad?
Yeah, I mean, he said he'll die with debt or whatever. And there are, you know, there's always a nuanced strategy somewhere that might work for someone. But typically, risk tolerance plays a role there, right? So yes, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Robert Kiyosaki might be fine to take on a bunch of debt because he has a multi-million or billion-dollar empire, as far as I'm aware. But for most people, that doesn't make sense because you just don't have the risk tolerance. 8% over a 5% interest rate is not guaranteed.
Correct.
So all of a sudden, if things go south, now not only have you lost money on your investment, now you owe a fixed amount plus interest.
So if you have a medical emergency or something
that's right,
happens, sure, on paper, and you have kind of this perfect strategy that looks great, you know, linearly speaking, and then all of a sudden one bad event, some outlier, whatever, then you're kind of in trouble. There's zero flexibility, and that does come down to risk tolerance. So that's a super important point. And
we've heard of people who have borrowed money to buy Bitcoin or something and made a killing, but not a reasonable strategy. You know, it's like betting your life savings on a roulette wheel. In hindsight, it can sound like the smartest idea, but at the end of the day, you're still taking on an incredible risk. Even if your odds are, you could say like a 50-50 roughly with a roulette table, probably not something you should be doing, putting your life savings on, right? Not
your retirement strategy.
Yeah. So just something on the topic of good debt, it's a finicky area because you have to really do those considerations, assess your risk tolerance, look at the parameters of the debt you're taking and the opportunity it's presenting you to consider whether it's good debt. But generally speaking, something that can be quite empowering. You know, in Canada, it's not to say this will always continue, but the reason real estate got so expensive and kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way is it seemed like free money. You take a mortgage and then your house is appreciating in value faster than the interest rate you're paying. You know, that's good debt in kind of a hindsight basis. So a lot of people ran to the space and kind of helped to that trend. So there can be issues with that. Well, another topic maybe, but another day. But then let's talk about bad debt. So what then defines when something falls into the category of bad debt?
Anything that's not good debt.
Okay, easy enough. Yeah.
All right. Moving on. No, it's...
Is that what they put on the government website?
That's right. Yeah. So bad debt, they define as anything, that you borrow money for non-essential items or things that lose value. It's often higher interest and may cause financial problems if it's managed poorly. So I think that's actually kind of a good way to put it, or good point, is just because it's bad debt or it's something on a depreciating asset doesn't mean right away it's just this awful thing that's going to cause you hardship. But if it's more likely, I guess, especially if you manage it poorly, because it's, you have a debt, you're probably going to be paying on something, whereas you're paying far longer than that thing holds value, or it's a depreciating asset. And so if there's any kind of issues, and if you're not managing properly, like, it's much more likely, I think, to get into financial hardship. And actually, I think the stats we kind of looked at earlier kind of prove that, or show that too, right? That sure, delinquencies are going up on one thing, but they seem to be kind of much more likely to go up or have issues on what would be kind of considered bad debt. What else do they say? So so examples are credit card debt, payday loans, personal loans. They say this: personal loans for unnecessary things.
Right. Which is pretty self-evident.
But that's a pretty, and that could be a pretty wide category, because I think we all probably have a little bit different of a view of what's necessarily unnecessary. Is that
right? Yeah. And mind you, when we say credit card debt, there's a valid strategy around having a credit card and paying it off immediately. Yeah. Something that is kind of underlying all of this discussion, which we haven't really talked about, is the concept of credit scores. Most people are probably familiar, but if someone has never heard of what a credit score is, there are agencies who keep track of your credit worthiness as an individual and assign you a credit score. And the higher your credit score, the more attractive, I guess, you are of a borrower from a lender's perspective, because it means you're less risky. And your credit score increases by paying your debts back on time, keeping low balances, things of that sort. But interestingly, in a weird sort of way, you have to take on debt to build a credit score. So someone who's never taken on debt in their life would actually probably not have a fantastic credit score, because there's just no data to go off of. So, which is kind of bizarre, it kind of incentivizes people to go into debt. But there are valid strategies around using credit cards and then paying them off, since they're revolving and they only accrue interest typically after that 1 month period, of paying them off immediately to build that credit. So there are strategies there. It's not just, I know there are, I've heard, and I love The Wealthy Barber. I know there was a strategy in one of the books that said, put your credit card in the freezer or something like that to avoid using it. But there is still that consideration
for sure
that using credit cards, while they might incentivize spending because it's easier than, say, handing over cash, can help build your credit.
But also, I don't know if you do the same, but for me and my family, everything goes on our credit card.
Yeah.
Everything, all of our expenses, all of our monthly recurring costs, everything's on a credit card, and we just, we pay it every month. But yeah, it's not just even that. It's just all sorts of points and those types of things too. And
that's right.
And I've even read before, look, I don't necessarily look in this way. Part of it's just convenience. Part of it's to get the points and that type of stuff. But it's also like, it's kind of like a free 30-day loan almost, in a way.
Yeah,
is
it
that,
is, yeah.
So, and I'm sure, so that's kind of it. But again, it has to be managed properly, because again, if you're like, okay, well, I'm doing it, and then 1 month something happens and you can't do it, well, then all of a sudden, it's the opposite with your credit rating. Doesn't help your credit rating to not pay it. Actually, it hurts it. And then, if it's at 18, 19%,
so a hefty fee. Yeah,
it's a pretty hefty cost if all of a sudden you can't do it. So
kind of an interesting not good debt to hold, I guess.
Right.
But a good tool to utilize for building a credit score, but a very dangerous one.
Yeah. But that just thinking of it, that might be kind of something not everybody necessarily understands, is that when you just for properly using a credit card, it's not that the minute you purchase something on your credit card you start owing interest. So it's after your due date.
Yeah.
I think cash advances are different. I think
so you get charged right away.
Right away.
Yeah.
So if you take a cash advance on your credit card, I think that's
that's when you withdraw money,
right,
like actual cash from, say, a register at a store or something.
Yeah. But if I make a purchase, and if I make a purchase on my credit card, I get my statement, has to be paid by X date. As long as I pay it by X date, I don't pay any interest.
Yeah.
And so I think, that's something.
So credit card debt is good debt for like 30 days.
Yeah, for like 30 days. That's
and then
right.
It becomes the worst.
And then it becomes, it goes from being good to real bad
very quickly. Yeah.
Very quickly.
Which is why it's dangerous, right?
Yeah,
exactly. So I have to be considerate of that stuff. And then, now we have to face buy now, pay later programs. which is a new form of financing. And there's
And
all.
if you haven't checked out our video on that one,
That's right. Episode 3, I think, maybe one of the
three.
earlier ones.
Yeah.
But you know, it's an interesting area that, again, kind of similar, might be attractive in some circumstances where, say, you're able to get 0% financing and spread out an expensive purchase over 4 payments, and then, you know, you could arguably say invest the difference or put it in a savings account and make money off the difference. But in most circumstances, we're seeing it used for small purchases, which is tricky when you start accumulating. And one thing we'll talk about this, is when you start accumulating a bunch of small debts, it becomes easier to mismanage it. It becomes easier to miss a payment or start accruing interest when you weren't intending to. And there's jokes online about, you know, financing your burrito purchase and things like that. Like, sadly, we're kind of moving towards that with a lot of these programs, right? Because it's getting easier to do.
My prediction is Starbucks is going to be the first coffee shop to have to buy now, pay later.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
Like a $10 latte or something.
Yeah. Well, as we discussed in our video, there are some services that let you basically port that service anywhere. So you can be a member of some of these companies and, similar to a credit card, use their service when paying, and then split your payment up into 4 equal installments, or for your burrito or your Starbucks Frappuccino or whatever it is. So kind of just that was a high level overview of again, good debt versus bad debt. Again, when discussing the idea of leverage, good debt can certainly help quite a bit, and leverage can be very attractive because, again, it helps amplify your returns and the gains you get from certain things, which is why we talk about using debt to buy a business or something. If your business is growing faster than the debt, that can be an attractive move. But it amplifies both ways. It amplifies your potential upside, it amplifies your potential downsides if things go south. So that's why we talk about risk tolerance and why that matters. If you're someone who's a student with no income, no savings, probably not a good idea to say take out a bunch of student debt and just put it into the market, for example. Whereas someone, again, like Robert Kiyosaki, kind of makes a bit more. I'm assuming he's wealthy. Maybe I don't know. I don't know what's happened recently. You know, probably has a bit more tolerance to take on these riskier strategies. So that's a high level overview of good debt versus bad debt, kind of the general differences between them. Again, when talking about leverage, the idea of how it can be beneficial, but you have to consider things like risk tolerance, how much risk you're able to take on, given that it amplifies both the upside and the downside of any strategy you use it for. But how do people actually fall into debt? And this will be kind of general. And obviously, it's important to highlight that everyone's situation is different. Like we highlighted earlier, some people get hit with the curveball in their financial plan. That's unfair and you know, could put anyone in a bad situation, losing your job, anything of that sort, right? Maybe you can speak a bit to how people get into debt. Yeah,
I think that, you know, I think it's almost probably like anything, is that I highly doubt there's anybody that who if you look at, you know, an individual, and I'm sure we've worked with or had friends or clients even that you've seen kind of debt get from in control to out of control. And I don't think anybody starts using debt with that kind of intent. It's like, you know what, one day I want my debt to be out of control. I want to stress every night about being able to make my payments. So I think it's one of those things that just, you know, it can kind of snowball a bit. And so I think then, if we look at what would get somebody's debt from kind of being in control and manageable and helping their life and helping them achieve their goals, and you know, debt will help you achieve short-term goals, needs, and kind of longer-term stuff too. We've talked about, you know, if it's starting a business or those types of things, education. But I think that it's just it could be, you know, just an unfortunate situation like a job loss or something. And so I think if you get used to with debt, it's all about kind of managing the payment and kind of matching, okay, well, I know I have X amount coming in, and, you know, okay, well, if I can manage this payment, I can manage this payment. Okay, I can manage this. And then, you know, so maybe it could be something like job loss or, you know, medical emergency that causes job loss or any of those types of things that would, you know, because that debt stays. And that payment stays, and it's if something happens to your income that changes your ability to make those debt payments. So I think it's just, you know, I think for the most part, it's just letting that kind of get out of control. Yeah. And sometimes I think it might be, you know, it might be something like that. Sometimes it just might be not managing it, or not understanding, or really just being like, yeah, I can, oh, and what's another $100 or another 200? And then all of a sudden, you know, and I almost look at it like, sometimes I look at it when, you know, my wife and I sit down and we budget sometimes, or we're looking, and all of a sudden you're like, we spent how much at, you know, eating out, or how much here, and you're like, oh, you don't really realize it until you sit down, put it together. And I, you know, or the other thing for me is I was looking the other day, going through your expenses, because I'm always looking, and, you know, you cut out cable to start thinking, okay, just with Netflix, all of a sudden you realize you have Netflix and this and that, and you have this monthly subscription, this monthly, and you're just like, oh my gosh, like you realize how much it pools. So I think that's part of kind of how it can get out of control.
Yeah. So the spending is obviously, I think it's the most visual reason for people to go into bad debt, and
for sure,
sad, you know, to the discredit of, or unfairly, I guess, it's kind of used kind of generally to assume that that's why everyone has fallen into debt.
Yeah.
And we'll talk, you know, there are, like you're touching on, kind of behavioral considerations around, because that does happen. People do overspend. Before getting into that quickly though, there are kind of other contributors, right? So we talked about the cost of living. So there are situations where your income doesn't keep pace with the expenses around you, and that plays a role. There are other things like changes in interest rates. So all of a sudden, especially here in Canada, where mortgage terms are typically only 5 years. So you can take a 20-year mortgage, but the company financing you only promises to contribute to that mortgage for 5 years, after which you have to renew either with them or another lender to continue towards that 20-year amortization. So every 5 years, and this is what we're currently experiencing in Canada, the cost of your house can vary quite drastically all of a sudden, and your monthly payments can change quite dramatically. And what we've seen in Canada is people took out mortgages at like 0.8 or 9% in Canada at the rock bottom rates. And now we've seen those, not too long ago, they were as high as 7%, now kind of sitting around the 4% range. And that's quite meaningful, you know. You can afford say a $800,000 property at a 0.8% mortgage, because your monthly payment might be relatively manageable. But all of a sudden, when that $800,000 property is charging a 4 or 5% interest rate, that's a very different payment on a monthly basis. You know, people have seen their payments increase 1,000% in some cases.
Yikes.
So yeah, you have your changes in cost of living, you have rising interest rates, you have changes in your own spending, and changes in your income can all influence how your debt can get out of hand. The spending, again, kind of the category everyone focuses on. And I think that's probably because it's the area that most of us have the control over. You know, we don't have as much control over inflation. Well, I have no control over inflation myself, but maybe it's different for Jerome Powell for some of those factors. But with spending, you know, there are considerations there as well. You know, even though I say it's kind of crudely used as an excuse, it is still an important consideration. And to your point, subscriptions have made it a lot easier to find your spending, get out of control. Buy now, pay later programs, making it easier to buy things up front. And behaviorally, those programs, subscriptions, buy now, pay later, and a lot of the marketing tactics out there are designed to make you feel less bad about spending your money. So it's very easy behaviorally, and probably harder or easier these days to fall into bad debt than it was, say, decades ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because companies are actively trying to get you to spend more, and they don't particularly care if you're in a lot of debt or
well, I actually saw, you know, it was I can't remember, but it was a TED Talk or something years ago, kind of talking about almost that kind of, I don't know if it's like a cultural shift or whatever you'd call it, of debt and the view of debt, and how, you know, decades ago, you know, debt outside of, say, mortgage debt or anything, but any kind of other debt was like a 4-letter word. It was not
right.
It was not acceptable. It was, you know, to have those types of debt was kind of almost looked down upon, and people would work really hard not to be in debt. You know, they would take on their mortgage, but outside of that, like, you know, having a car loan or something like that just wasn't. I mean, that's also probably when cars were, you know, $3,500 for a brand new car, but you know, whereas now it's, you know, it's a fact of life, you know, like, you know, whatever, even almost your income bracket, you know, it's just you're financing part of your life, and
Yeah.
and there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. It's just, but with that kind of acceptance and that view, and even in our world and kind of the wealth management, financial planning world, like the idea of going into retirement with any debt at all was just,
Taboo.
it was taboo almost, and it was something to be avoided. And it was, whereas now it's not necessarily as uncommon, or it's not as like, I think most people still would prefer to not go into retirement with debt. But even kind of that, it's not necessary, it's viewed a little bit differently. And so and I think part of it is just kind of a shift on what is affordable. Like affordable, this is, we talk about my parents but my dad would always say, like, even with its credit card or anything like that, don't buy it unless you can afford it. Like to buy it, right? Outside of a home or maybe a car, like anything else, like if you can't, affording it is being able to pay for it.
So if you didn't have the credit card, if you're able to buy it regardless, then you can justify it.
So if you want to put it on your credit card to earn the points or to delay the payment or whatever, if you happen to be able to on a car get like 0% financing or something like that, great. But don't buy it. Like what's affordable is being able to buy it, and kind of thing. And now, and it's kind of the way we're advertised too. It's everything's a payment. Like everything is a payment, and that's what's affordable. Is like as long as they're all payments. And then the other thing I think what that ignores a bit, and I think we're all guilty of this maybe a bit, is when you're looking at just the payment, I think we kind of ignore what the true cost of everything is.
Yeah.
If you look at that car, even if you look at your home or you look at anything and you look at not just the purchase price, but you look at the total cost of financing that over whatever the term of that loan is, it's pretty staggering how much interest, is being paid or add. And you look at that car can add, thousands of dollars to that purchase price of that car, by financing it and that type of stuff. So I think it's just maybe, and I'm not saying we're going to go back to that time where having debt is this bad thing. I think with inflation and the cost of living and everything, I think that's just that's not realistic. But I think a good place to start is truly understanding the cost of stuff and looking beyond just, I can afford that payment, and also we talked about this too, is not just can I afford this payment, but I also have a little wiggle room just in case something goes wrong. I don't want to, I have 1,000, I have X amount coming in. Okay, I can have X amount going out, making sure that there's that buffer, having emergency funds, planning kind of for contingencies, those types of things are all kind of important.
Yeah. And so, you raise a good point about the shifting mindset from the total cost of something to the monthly payment, right? Because if you were advertised, you can buy this TV for a total lifetime expense of $1,500 or upfront for $1,000, you'd probably say, well, that's stupid. Why would I pay $1,500? But if they say, well, for a low monthly cost of $50 a month, all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't have $1,000 up front, but I do have $50 a month for my income, So that's a good consideration is looking at the total cost of things. And in doing that assessment, again, when we talk about leverage, comparing, obviously TV's probably not something you should be doing this calculation. What's my joy return on this TV? Plasma's not a thing anymore, but it used to be the big thing back in the 90s. I don't know why I said that. 4K or 8K TV now.
Your laser disc player hooked up to your plasma TV.
Yeah. But your 8K TV screen, but with investments, comparing the expected rate of return over interest, you can kind of justify good debt if there's a positive difference, but if there's a negative difference, obviously it gets bad. But the other consideration outside of just companies shifting the focus to monthly payments is you also have like pretty bad advertising from things like payday loans and even the financiers at sometimes, which I think is quite, payday loans could be its own topic because it's some really kind of gross practices there. But, you see I see them all the time of like, 200 for 20, like if the advertisement is you're paying $20 to get 200. And it's like, well, no, that's $20 of interest. You're paying $220 for $200,
right?
Effectively, right?
Yeah.
But there are things like that where advertising and marketing is used in a way to shift your mindset. It's framed differently to make it feel less bad or easier to take, or even attractive in the case of, say, payday loans, especially because they tend to target people who might be in a bad situation or might not have an understanding or education in finance, you have to be careful because there are a lot of companies that are using these strategies. So something to keep in mind as well is that you really have to be on top of. It really is an uphill battle with everything you face, unfortunately. And what's really tricky is it's a bit of a vicious cycle where if someone finds themselves in bad debt, not only can that spiral because now your expenses are increasing, so now you have to take on more debt to pay off the debt, but it psychologically and behaviorally gets harder to tackle the debt because all of a sudden something that could have been addressed with less effort earlier on is a mountain to climb. And you do have this, you've talked about this before, but there are a lot of people who kind of actively are ignorant to their debt situation because they don't want to look at it and they don't want to address it. The view that, well, I'm just bad at money or I'm just bad with debt.
Just accept it. Yeah, almost.
Yeah. And, they might cover their bases or their minimum payments, but they just kind of, accept that, well, I'm probably in debt, but that's just, my circumstance. So,
yeah. Well, I think if most of us, I know me for sure, every time we ever do take a look at our expenses, and then there's certain things you're like, I know we probably eat out a little too much, or we probably spend a little. When you actually calculate it, you actually put the numbers, it's every time I do that exercise, it's worse than expected.
Right. Yeah.
And I think something like debt for a lot of people, it would probably be the same. Yeah. If somebody sat down and looked at and actually did that exercise of looking, well, how much am I actually making in payments?
Yeah.
Or, okay, I in the last whatever years I bought this car, I financed this TV, this plasma TV.
Really bad investment.
Really bad. And you add all that up and you say, okay, well, I had X amount of this and I've actually spent this much money on that with all these payments and all this interest. If you put that together, or even like I said, if you just, okay, because a lot of depending, I think there's always different kind of levels of financial kind of tracking responsibility that everyone has. But there are, I think that like you kind of said it, that just, ignorant in a way, and not meaning that in a derogatory term, but just not knowing. It's just, I know right now, thankfully I have more coming in than it's going out, but you don't truly understand what's going out, and you don't truly understand that cost of what's going out. And I think that I think is kind of the recipe how it can get out of control. Anything can get out of control, especially if you don't totally know where you're at with it.
Yeah. And I know you might see someone in debt and you might think, well, how do they let themselves get to this point? But we've talked before about things like mental bandwidth, and with this vicious cycle, it's, speaking of mental bandwidth, well, nothing probably takes away your mental bandwidth more than everyday stress and feeling like you're drowning effectively. So, it's easy to say when you're on the other side, well, you just stop spending your money or stop taking on debt. But you have to acknowledge that there are psychological variables that make it harder, physically and emotionally harder to address these issues when they start getting out of control, which is why it's obviously better to tackle it as early as you can. And if you feel like you aren't on top of debt and don't fully understand it, it's always best to learn as early as you can. And kind of the first step to getting on top of debt. So we'll talk a bit about strategies for how people can manage their debt better, or if they're in a bad financial situation, how to better get on top of it. Obviously, there's nothing that's a golden kind of ticket or easy solution.
It is true. I kind of was thinking about, I was driving on my way over here. I'm thinking, okay, well, what's the ultimate kind of purpose of the podcast in a way? And I'm like, well, I just hope people aren't tuning in thinking okay, Derek and Rich are going to have some
solution,
okay,
right?
All right.
That's right.
Okay, what's the easy way out? And I actually, somebody shared a cartoon with me once, and it was, someone sitting in a financial planner's office, and it was like, I want to retire next year. I have $0 in savings. Work your magic kind of thing. And that's I think that's one of the kind of the main important things. If anybody thinks that we have some magical strategy that's going to be it's just going to wash everything away, fake your own death and
exactly.
steal an identity or something.
Maybe in some countries, but
not here, right?
Yeah.
So there is no kind of just magic fix all. Like it's like anything. If you're wanting to get healthier, if you want to do anything, it'll take work, right? It'll take a bit of commitment and work, and takes time to kind of take something out of control and bring it back into control. But
it's actually why I don't like a lot of the debt content out there, because I think, and this might be valuable for some people. Some people find this motivating, and if that helps you, great. But there's a lot of content that will just, yell at you about getting in the right mindset or things like that. Again, if that's something that in your state of, say, minimal mental bandwidth, not minimal, but
yes,
taking
you
away
all have minimal mental
That's not what
bandwidth.
I meant.
Every one of you.
That's not what I meant. If you find yourself in a stressful situation, it's harder for you to focus, and this stuff helps you, then great. Then that content is serving a purpose. But there's a lot of stuff that it almost feels like, well, if you just get the right mindset, you'll be on top of your debt. And it's like, no, it's a difficult practice, and it takes time and effort, and it might not work for some people.
Right.
But there are nonetheless things that, knowing is truly half the battle. And there are aspects that if you understand better, can at least better inform your difficult journey towards that solution. So, but great point, because I see that, it's quite frustrating, and that simplified approach of just like, well, just stop being stupid is basically the solution.
I might have mentioned this before. We might have talked about this before, but when this is long before I had kids. This was years ago. I used to listen to this. It was like CNBC radio or something. It was on XM radio. This is back when like XM radio first came out, and it was, and anyway, there's some debt financial guru guy, and he all I remember about him, like people would call in, and they would explain how they got into financial debt or how this, and they're feeling this and they're feeling this, and he would just basically, and his advice always, and it wasn't bad advice.
Dave Ramsey?
What's that?
Is this Dave Ramsey?
It could have been
someone like that.
Yeah,
okay.
it could have been someone like that. But all I just remember him talking about was like, and it sound advice, because in the end, it comes down to being like, well, make more money or spend less,
right? Yeah.
And then pay down your debt faster. That was kind of always what it was. But it was like, get your spending under control, and if you eat rice and beans. That's what I just remember. He's always like, eat rice and beans. Like, just rice and beans are cheap, so don't go out eat. Like, just keep eating rice and beans. But he was kind of almost like, he was just a little bit aggressive about it. And then I would think most people would be like, screw that, I'll just stay in debt then. Like, if that's what it's going to take, or like,
yeah, it's an interesting. So there's a modern day equivalent of that. There's a creator by the name of Caleb Hammer who does what are called financial audits, and the idea, I think, is great, of sitting down with someone, going through everything by detail. But it's kind of become a bit of a drama show where it's like, oh my God, can you believe how bad this person is at spending and stuff?
So then everybody else can watch it and feel better about themselves.
A little bit.
Okay, I'm not that bad. All right.
And I think that when it comes to that content, it again, everyone's different. Some people being yelled at might be the thing that they need. It might be.
Yeah.
My experience and what I find with most people is that just pushes people to further ignore the problem, because it doesn't give them a solution per se. And I'm not saying he might give solution, and I think he tries to give solutions towards the end of the video. But my experience is that most people, it needs to be a more constructive conversation than that. And I think there's also a high rate of call it relapsing of people on those shows when they're just yelled at about being in bad debt. So in terms of, we've talked a lot about, okay, so what are the actual things to consider? Right. There's, for one, knowing is truly half the battle. I know that's a cliche, but the first step among everything else is, of course, just understanding your situation. That means taking your monthly statements, going through and understanding how much you're spending, the debts you currently have, the balances you owe, the interest rates you pay, and summarizing all of it as best you can to comprehend, your situation. It's the first thing we do as financial planners when we have a client come on, and we're obligated to. You have to know your client, but one of the first things you do is get someone's financial profile, understand how much they owe on their house, how much they owe on their cars, all those things. Understanding what they're paying in terms of their living expenses and things like that.
It's like any goal setting kind of scenario, or anything that you want to accomplish, whether you're, an athlete trying to achieve something, or you're a business owner trying to achieve, or whether, like you said, when we're getting into financial planning and wealth management with clients, it's, in the end, you want to get here. And how do you know, and how can you develop a strategy on how to get here if you don't have a clear picture of where you're starting from?
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly the best advice, probably, the best place to start. if you're feeling, as soon as you start feeling overwhelmed financially, or you're worried about, can I make the payments or this, or even if you're not at that, like ideally you want to get your finances into a great place long before you feel out of control.
Yeah.
So, but the best way is, to start is, let's get a really clear picture. So, don't just, well, I think I'm doing okay, or I think I'm only doing this. Sit down, be honest, gather up, like actually use real numbers, get all of your payments together, get all of your statements. How in debt am I? What are all the interest rates I'm paying? How long am I paying this for? Compare that to the money I come in, like really get a clear picture and a clear starting point.
Yeah. And if you have a really messy starting point, working towards cleaning that up. So if you, for example, have 7 credit cards that you're using regularly, even if it means, if you are in a bad financial situation, even if it means you're losing points at a certain store because, you have, say, a Canadian Tire credit card and a Walmart credit card, and, if you have all those credit cards, but you find you're not able to stay on top of it. I think the benefit of simplifying your situation, if you're in a bad financial position, far outweighs the small point difference you'll get between the different cards. So that will make it easier to track your payments. I've mentioned before that for myself, and I think you do something similar. The way I keep track of my spending is getting my monthly statements, or just logging into my credit cards about twice a month. So basically bi-weekly I go in, and I categorize all my expenses, but I have a budget spreadsheet and I have different categories. So things like mortgage payment, daycare, groceries, and home essentials. And then I have discretionary categories, and I go and I itemize every line item of my credit card. And it takes probably 10 minutes every 2 weeks, but that's what I do to stay on top of things. And once you get it set up, it probably takes a lot more work to get started. But once you have it and you make it that habit or that routine, it's a lot easier to stay on top of it and to understand your situation. Same thing for summarizing your credit cards, right? Once you have gone through the work of doing it, it's going to be a lot easier to keep track of. And if you can take steps to simplify it, that's all the better. That's kind of the first thing, obviously, taking all the monthly statements you get, understanding the monthly payments you're making, the interest rates you're paying on your debts. You can even look into things like the amortization, how long it's outstanding for, the terms, because some different loans, specifically mortgages, will have specific terms. Some might not let you pay down earlier, whereas credit cards, obviously you can kind of pay down immediately as soon as you can. But understanding the terms of the debts you take on, ideally before you take those debts, but obviously, my first, maybe this is telling, but my first credit card I got for a box of cookies at Loblaws, so I'm not one to speak about maybe the threshold of entering into a credit card arrangement. But I was a finance student, I understood credit cards, I should say. But I'll just say that before you enter debts, obviously, is the best point. But if you have these debts and need to now do that work, it's still worth doing. It still helps you get to that starting point.
Do you remember what credit card it was?
It's just a Loblaws, like the PC.
Okay.
PC,
yeah, mine was like a GM Financial, GM Visa, like like General Motors.
Really?
Yeah, it was GM Visa. They used to have a Visa, and then you would earn points that you could use towards buying a new GM vehicle.
No kidding.
Yeah,
huh.
I remember. Yeah, I got it at I applied for it at they had a booth at Saskatchewan Roughriders football game, and nice. I think you got like a free Saskatchewan Roughriders like towel or something like that. And I'm like, ooh.
In my defense, it was actually a decent 0 fee credit card.
Yeah, this one was too.
So
0 fee. You got good.
Fine,
yeah. No, it was actually a good one, and I got a free. I think it was a scarf or towel or something. Yeah, but it was good.
Yeah, acknowledging my own shortcomings, trying to encourage others to be more on top of it if they're in a bad financial situation. Not something that was an issue for me at all. It was actually more so that I was like, I need a credit card, and then I walked to a grocery store, and they're like, cookies?
It was timing wise too. It was actually because it was. I might have even talked about this in one of our earlier episodes about, kind of learning financial behavior, but it was my dad, same thing. He encouraged me. He said, as soon as you turn 18, go get a credit card. His advice was get the lowest limit they'll allow you to have.
Right.
Never spend money, but it's, he wanted me to start building a credit history, kind of learning to manage it. And, and same thing. It's like, but you never, his advice was like, one, nothing ever goes on that credit card that you don't have the cash in your account to pay for right away. Like, you always make sure it gets paid off every month, but having it, and I think that's one of the big things. We've probably talked about it already enough, but just, we're not here to say debt's bad, all debt's bad, or that you can't, but it's really just comes down to the management of it. So
yeah. So first step obviously is getting an understanding of your situation. Once you've done that, again, this is not to oversimplify it, but reducing spending is going to be the first line of defense, I guess, is a way to put it, for trying to get on top of your credit card debt. We talked about subscriptions, and I think if you go, you don't have to take my extensive routine and copy it, but if you go by line items on your credit card, that helps you identify those recurring payments. I'll even share an example where we had a friend play a video game and want to play a video game online, so we subscribed. It's like $5 a month to subscribe. So I was like, sure, I'll pay $5 for one game, and then sure enough, I paid it the next month.
right.
And monitoring that credit card helped me ensure that I could cut it right away and stop it from being $200, over a couple of years. So just a consideration there with taking that approach. It does help you identify those subscriptions. And if you categorize your expenses, you can see how much you're spending on eating food out. And I don't know if I would go as far as to say only rice and beans, but there are considerations you can do at that step but you have to understand your situation, which is why that's such an important first step to do that. After that, avoiding accumulating new debt is obviously going to be a consideration, something that gets harder when you are in kind of that debt spiral, I guess, because your expenses are rising. But reducing how many credit cards you have, avoiding taking out new ones. There are some strategies. Again, you might have one credit card that offers a 0% interest for 6 months when you transfer a balance. Again, those might make sense, but you have to consider things like the mental bandwidth and things like that, right? You might think up front, well, that's rational. Of course, I will transfer my balance and, do that for 6 months. But in that 6 month period, if you aren't staying on top of that and suddenly you're spending more because now you don't have that interest payment or whatever it is, yes, it makes sense on paper, and it's not to say I think that would be a great strategy to do if you have the opportunity, but you just have to be on top of it. You have to understand, and that's why I always highlight mental bandwidth and getting things into a routine, so it takes less of that.
Yeah, I do it with myself. Like, be realistic with myself, because you're like, in that moment, you're like, yeah, I'm going to do it. But then I have to, am I actually going to have the time to do this? Am I really going to manage, or is this actually something that's probably going to put me farther behind or whatever? Yeah.
And, that's where you can look at these things as a family. And obviously money is still a topic that some view as a taboo within their own walls even. But tap on the resources you have available to you, the people who can help guide you through this. Obviously, it can be shameful at times or might make you feel shameful, but debt is something we're all dealing with. So, I think that's a good point as well in terms of trying to get on top of it. Something you've added here as well is increasing monthly payments. So obviously every credit card and the like will have a minimum amount that you have to pay to avoid being considered delinquent. And that minimum amount will at least cover the interest, but it doesn't always pay down your balance or reduce how much you're paying. And there are some credit cards that if you only ever make, or some types of debts, I should say, I don't know if credit cards specifically, where if you only make the minimum payment, you will never pay down the debt.
You'll never pay it down. And I think they show now on credit card statements, which is good. It's kind of almost like the warning on cigarette packaging, but it'll tell you if you only make the minimum payment, how many years it would take you to pay it down. And it's like crazy.
So that's a consideration as well, as you can pay off things faster. There are calculators you can use out there to help determine how long it'll take to pay off your debts at different payments. So you can always utilize those tools. Maybe I'll see if I can find a link for some to include in the description down below if you're able to access that. But anything that helps you pay down your debts faster will obviously help you get on top of it. Applying the savings from if you are able to reduce spending to the debts. And here, people will ask, well, what if I take the money and I go and save it instead of paying down the debt more? So let's say you get some, say $100 a month of excess savings from cutting your spending. Do you apply that to your debts, or do you invest that or save it? And there's kind of an argument you can make for both sides. And I'm curious to hear your viewpoint on that. But mine would be, again, considering mental bandwidth. If debt is the source of your stress, tackle that first, put it towards that. You can do the consideration of how much interest you're paying on a debt versus returns. Yeah. So if you have a credit card debt balance that's paying a 20% interest rate, there's almost no circumstance where I would say you should put that money elsewhere outside of just paying down the debt. Because effectively, when you pay down the debt, in a way, you're earning a guaranteed 20% return on that money. Because by avoiding a 20% cost, you're basically saving that or earning that 20% return. And there's not many investments that offer a 20% guaranteed, if any. There's no investments that offer guaranteed 20% return out there.
Unless you buy our cryptocurrency course.
That's right.
That's coming out pretty soon.
Exactly. So, that's a consideration as well. Some people will say, well, if I have excess savings, should I put it towards a rainy day fund and invest it, or just focus on debt? Because, some people, it feels kind of gross to not have any savings. And obviously it's a bit disparaging to only be paying down your debt to see everything go right towards it. But mathematically, it usually makes most sense when that's high interest debt.
Yeah.
When it's not as high interest, I think there's a bit more of an argument, and maybe you can speak to situations where you might consider doing both.
Well, I think for one, if it's something, if it's lower interest, if it's something that has an amortization, because I think that's the other thing too, is knowing that like debts like credit cards or even lines of credit, stuff like that, those types of things that if you're only paying interest or, doing the minimum, like that's debt, theoretically, you're going to have for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah.
So I think that's, of course, what you prioritize. And maybe if it's a car loan or a student loan or something and the interest rate's a little bit more manageable, or you could at least have a line of sight, be like, I know that at least if I continue status quo, that in 3 years, 4 years, 6 years, this is going to be paid off, that's a little bit different. So then maybe, maybe if I'm every dollar I have is going to that, but then something else happens, especially like, I would think in certain scenarios, like say I have a car loan that I know is going to be paid off in 5 years. And if I'm putting every single dollar I have to pay that off quicker, and I'm not building up any savings, and I don't have any other access to, like, say, a line of credit or kind of lower cost debt, and then all of a sudden something financially happens, I can't go back into that car loan and borrow money back from that. Yeah. And then I might end up having to go to a high interest debt. So that might be a scenario where where it's like, I don't want to put every single dollar to pay that out and then put myself into financial difficulty on the other side. Whereas if it's, if it's a credit card debt and it's 18.99%, every excess dollar could be going to that, because worst case scenario, if something financial, so I'm probably going to end up having to take that money off my credit card maybe anyway, if I have no other access to it. So that time period I was paying that off, again,
consideration as well.
Yeah, it's another consideration. So everybody's scenario is a little bit different. And again, I think it all then goes back to first getting a really good handle on your scenario.
Yeah. So in terms of which debts to pay off first and the focus there, obviously we've talked about paying off high interest debts first. So generally speaking, that's what people call the waterfall method.
Correct.
Meaning that you put money so you make all your minimum payments. Once you have your debt organized, you calculate what your minimum payments are, and you make sure you cover that with everything, because the last thing you want is to reach delinquency, which can actually increase the cost of interest, which we'll touch on towards the end. So obviously you want to make all your minimum payments to avoid any trouble. And then any excess amounts you put first towards your highest interest debts. Obviously there are other considerations you want to have in mind, but generally speaking, that's the approach you want to take. Because mathematically, that's going to be the most efficient method towards paying off your debt. There is another method that I'll let you speak to, Derek, called the snowball method, which actually advocates instead of focusing on small debts first. Right. So regardless of interest, or maybe in hybrid consideration with interest, focusing on smaller balances rather than on interest, even if they aren't the lowest interest and maybe, or the highest interest rather. Maybe.
It's kind of like a momentum based strategy in that, like, you list all of your debts and you might have, a higher, like a credit card and student loan or this or that, but you might have something that's got a kind of a lower amount. So you focus on paying that down first. And so what you're trying to do is really focus on you start with anything that has got the lowest balance and you work really hard to pay that off. And you kind of building momentum. That's kind of the idea why they call it kind of the snowball, the snowball method. But it does seem counterintuitive, especially if the smaller amount might have this lower interest and you're really focused on that. But I think again, we've talked a little bit about behavioral aspect, a lot of this, and we talked about how sometimes this can be overall very overwhelming.
Yeah.
And if I think our kind of emotional defense mechanism when something's overwhelming is just to like forget it.
Yeah.
And just be like, yeah, whatever. So I think that this kind of snowball method can work with that, because you can be very focused and you start building momentum. It's like, okay, yes, this wasn't the highest interest debt, but I got that taken care of. And
Right.
you know, it's like, well, I just wiped out that whole debt. I closed that account, and now I'm on to the next one. And it kind of becomes, I think it kind of emotionally can
Right.
be a pretty good strategy. So I think between the two, I think one is, you know, I think the waterfall method, or like paying the highest interest, like, you know, mathematically for sure, that's going to be, that makes the most sense. But if your highest interest debt is also your biggest account, it just might feel overwhelming. Like you might be like, I'm just so far off of having that paid. Like by the time I finally get that done, like and then again, you kind of bury your head in the sand. So maybe it makes sense. Just, you know, I'm going to get these little ones away first. I'm going to just focus, get those. That's going to feel good. I'm going to build momentum, and then I'm going to go and tackle the big one.
And it's all up, you know, it's all so unique to someone's situation, right? In terms of what motivates them, in terms of what's going to lead to the best effective outcome, right? So with one person, you might have them fail under the waterfall method, but succeed under the snowball method, and that would be the best approach to take. Yeah. You know, if someone has, say, 30 different types of debt, snowball method might make a lot of sense. If, say, you have a bunch of financed products at, I was going to say Hudson Bay, but not anymore. At a store or something, you know, that might make more sense to tackle, even like you said, if it's a lower interest, just to simplify the situation.
That's right.
But you still consider interest rates, right? So it's just to say that while mathematically it'll make more sense to tackle high interest rates first, there's that emotional consideration as well, because there are people who might, again, fail under a waterfall method but succeed under a snowball method. So
Fun fact, I was on another podcast and we were kind of discussing this, and I actually called the waterfall method the snowball method, and I just got roasted in the comments. So we were very
right. That's
mostly by one person.
We only have two types of
this
methods
is the expert.
Here. That's right. Well, to be fair, we don't use that in terminology.
It's actually true. You don't. It's not really a tech. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, that's
it's kind of a broad term people use. But
that's right.
That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, in terms of other things to consider, ways to possibly reduce your interest rate. So, if you have a credit card debt, there might be credit cards out there that have a lower interest rate, and it's not likely going to be meaningful, but anything can help if you have the bandwidth to tackle that. There's also things like consolidation loans. So with a consolidation loan, what you're doing is you're taking out a type of debt to consolidate all your other debts, as the name implies.
Correct.
Meaning you borrow money to pay off all your other debts so that you only have one payment to look at, one debt to consider. So that can, of course, make sense if you have a bunch of other debts. And what's great about consolidation debts, if you have the capacity and the credit score to do so, is that at times it can actually reduce your effective interest rate across your debt profile.
And it could bring in, and I think the other benefit too that's often overlooked is that a lot of times you'll be rolling in like revolving debt, like a credit card or lines of credit, stuff that, really doesn't have, kind of a payoff date. And if you put everything in a consolidation loan, not only can you reduce your interest rate, then you have all of your debts into kind of something that has a shelf life or an amortization that will all be paid off.
Yeah. If you cover your payments, will eventually be paid off. So common forms of consolidation loans can include lines of credit, which can be revolving, but also a home equity line of credit, which is when sort of like a mortgage, very similar to a mortgage, but sort of after
using
the fact.
Using the equity in your home to secure some debt, and then usually, especially when you are able to do that, if you do have equity in a home to use, then you're lower risk to the bank, so you'll have a lower interest rate as well.
Yeah, lenders will charge you a lower interest rate the less risk they're taking on.
That's
so
right.
if you have collateral that you're able to put up, which is risky to you, mind you. So keep that in mind.
Yeah,
that
it is. That's a good point.
If you put your home equity up, if you aren't able to pay that debt, that means you've put your home on the line.
Correct.
So consideration there. But if you have a home and if you're able to make a plan that you can stick to, it can be quite beneficial to use that equity as collateral, because when all is said and done and you've paid it off, you would have paid a lower effective rate, simplified your financial situation, and maintain your home equity by the end of it. So all things to consider as well with tackling debt. But then, the last one, and it's kind of a cliche, I guess, but talking to a professional. In Canada, we have what are called licensed insolvency trustees, which are a regulated type of advisor that you can speak to. And in fact, if you want to declare bankruptcy, which we'll touch on in a moment, you have to have a licensed insolvency trustee in Canada. So you actually have to go through this professional, which makes sense because you don't want people just kind of willy-nilly declaring bankruptcy without knowing the implications. But that's someone you can speak to. There are also charity groups and the like that you can, social programs, government programs you can look into, and resources to learn more about your options and things like that. But truly speaking to a professional can be what you need, if not just for credit counseling. In the US, they're called credit counselors. And I think we have credit counselors as well. But licensed insolvency trustee is sort of the legal one that can actually has the authority to help you go declare bankruptcy if you need to. They can also, and they can also help you put together what's called a consumer proposal. Right. So if you're in a situation where your debt is crippling, if you're not able to get on top of it, there's actually a method you can carry out called a consumer proposal, which is effectively renegotiating with your creditors.
I think it's kind of like the first big step before you, like, you would try that before bankruptcy.
Yeah. So what it involves is, because lenders don't want you to go bankrupt. They don't want you to not be able to pay your debts.
Because that could discharge the debt. Like you know,
they might lose more money that they lent you if you go bankrupt. So with a consumer proposal, this is often done through a professional or a lawyer. Before going over that, the other professional you can obviously speak to is a financial planner. I should highlight that. You don't have to go right to the insolvency trustee, but an advisor or planner who probably more so you have to be careful not to go to an investment advisor who only sells investment products for debt management, because you might be still in debt when you leave and now you have a GIC, you know? But there are financial planners, fee-only financial planners, and debt consultants that will look at your circumstance and help you put a plan together. There is a fee to that, so you have to consider that. That does kind of push the bar even, brings the bar even higher for what you have to pass over, but something that might benefit people. But going back to the consumer proposal, through a professional, you're able to negotiate a payment plan that might give you some wiggle room, some space to breathe. So they might actually lower your interest rates with the consumer proposal. Now, there are legal restrictions, so it's not sort of a get out of jail free card. There's also obligations on your behalf to ensure that you're able to make those payments. And there will be restrictions on the debt you can typically take on when you have a consumer proposal. But all to say that that's a method to explore as well. And then worth talking about the process of bankruptcy. Obviously, it's the thing that is a bit taboo, and you know, most people would hopefully will never experience it.
It's kind of the last case, you know, like it's the last thing you'd want to explore, but it is there.
Yeah,
right?
it is there.
It's better than, you know, I think it's when it's not ideal, and hopefully there's interventions that you can do much earlier before you get there. But you know, if for whatever reason, especially if we're talking, you know, certain things, like it can be explored, and it could still have an effect, and you know, make somebody's situation might be hard to go through, but I think then it's almost like a fresh start in a way, kind of to some degree.
And I think it's often very misunderstood. I think we have this idea. So liquidation bankruptcy, as it's called in Canada, I forget what the chapters are in the US, but the US defines both a consumer proposal and a liquidation bankruptcy both as bankruptcies, but they're different chapter bankruptcies. Okay. In Canada, we just call one consumer proposal and we call the other a liquidation bankruptcy. Okay. As the name implies, what typically happens is you have a trustee assigned to you, so someone who has the obligations of the creditors in mind. They actually take control of your assets and then sell them to try and meet creditor obligations. So typically there's a meeting of the creditors. They sort of figure out who has a priority claim and how much every party will be paid, and then they take your assets, control of your assets, and sell them. What's worth highlighting, not to try and make bankruptcy sound more attractive, but worth highlighting is that there are exemptions, personal exemptions to the liquidation process. So things like clothing and furniture, up to certain dollar limits, are actually exempt from the liquidation process. So while there's often that view of, being left with nothing but a barrel when you've been liquidated.
The barrel with suspenders.
That's
though.
right, with suspenders, yeah. No, they take those too.
Yeah.
That's actually not the case. In fact, in Canada, a chunk of your RSP savings are actually exempt from the liquidation process. Now, it doesn't mean you can't abuse that. If they see that you've made a contribution before declaring bankruptcy, it can actually null your whole bankruptcy status, which will kind of put you in a very disadvantaged position. So it's not to say you can abuse these limits, but it's just to highlight that it's not as perhaps devastating of a process as some people imagine, where they're literally left on the street when they declare bankruptcy.
Yeah, they have rules and regulations, so that you don't abuse it, or you don't okay, well, I know I'm going to run up a bunch of spending and then try to hide and protect a bunch of money so that you can get away because I won't need it. So I think they do have...
Same with the personal exemptions, I would imagine. Like, if you buy a Rolex watch just under the minimum a week before you declare bankruptcy,
right?
I don't know if they probably still take a Rolex. I don't know if that counts as a personal exemption. You'll have to look at the resources, which I'll include down below if you want to see what the categories are. But there are categories worth knowing. It's just to highlight that they consider motivations, right? They consider whether someone's trying to abuse a system when they go through the court system. And the last thing to consider with bankruptcy, well, there are lots of things to consider, but the last thing we'll cover is that when you declare bankruptcy, that tends to affect your credit score for 7 years. So for a 7-year period, it becomes very difficult to have any sort of debt thereafter, because lenders, again, know that you're someone who had debt and wasn't able to pay it back. So what that means is during that period, you either can't get debt, or any debt you can get is going to be incredibly expensive.
Right.
So very high interest rate. So very important pull or drawback of the process.
Cosign or something like that. Then
That's right.
Yeah.
So something to consider as well. Now, credit scores are meant to heal over time. So after that 7-year period, you can work on rebuilding if that's something you need to do. But just to highlight, it's not something to be taken lightly. It's not an easy solution that some people might view it as. It can have very long-lasting effects. But it is a tool out there and something to consider, and something definitely worth speaking to a professional about if you find you're in that circumstance. But that's kind of debt in a nutshell anyway. I don't know if you have any other comments to add about the topic.
Yeah, just to wrap it up, when I'm looking at these kind of strategies and stuff we go through, I thought just an important point to make too is it isn't just you pick this one or you do this one. Sometimes it's a combination, or sometimes, if you start, like, for say you look, okay, a consolidation loan might be the best ultimate avenue, but you might go to the bank and the bank might say no. Yeah. And that doesn't mean you're like, okay, oh, well, I guess I'm out. You might have to go back, and you might have to do, because it might be like maybe your credit score isn't there, or maybe, your whatever income doesn't quite support it, or whatever it might be. So that might mean you have to go back and try something like a debt waterfall, or do something to start maybe paying down debt, getting your credit rating a little bit better. And then, so you might have to take some small steps first, and then go back to the bank and then be like, okay, now you're at a point that we can do the consolidation loan, and then you get the consolidation loan. And then once you get the consolidation loan, then it's just, and it almost becomes its own big, like, waterfall of a strategy.
Right,
like you start small,
the more you
get it under
it,
control, and then the more, and then it just gets better until you really got it under control. So I think, don't think, well, I have to pick one or these strategies. Like it's going to be a bit
fluid
different
situation.
For everybody. Yeah, it is a fluid situation. Yeah. And I mean, I think the biggest thing is start with knowing where you're at, figuring out where you're at, and then kind of going with finding what strategy kind of best fits, and then go from there.
Yeah, I think if nothing else, it all shows that the earlier you start addressing it, but obviously the earlier you learn about debt and all these topics, the better situation naturally will put you in. So whether you're starting from square one, you don't have any debt yet, but you're going to at some point, or you're in the weeds of it and tackling it, today's kind of the best day to obviously start looking at it and figuring it out. Thank you for joining us for today's episode on debt. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, feel free to let us know if you're watching on YouTube, and let us know any other topics you'd like us to cover in the future. As this episode kind of tests too, we're looking to cover basics of personal finances. So really any topic, whether I might have covered on the Plain Bagel before, or
anything on your mind,
anything finance related. If you want a day trading course, let us know. We'll sell it to you down below. But yeah, thank you for joining us. We'll catch you in the next one. Until then, cheers.